Before the Second World War turned Europe into a landscape of fires and ruins, the American army was still living with the weight of an older conflict. The memories of the trenches in France, of mud that swallowed boots and of artillery that hammered lines into stillness, hung over military thinking like a heavy fog. Many officers believed that the next war would look much like the last one, only larger and louder. Lines of infantry, long preparations, massive barrages, and slow, grinding advances remained the familiar script. Yet beneath the surface, the world was moving faster than those old ideas. Tanks no longer seemed like awkward iron boxes. Airplanes no longer felt like fragile novelties. Radios had turned voices into invisible threads that could tie units together across miles. In Europe, some armies were already experimenting with combining these tools into swift, coordinated blows. Their exercises hinted at wars of movement rather than wars of trenches, but across the ocean, much of the American army still studied lessons drawn almost entirely from the past. On dusty training grounds, young officers marched platoons in neat lines and rehearsed set-piece attacks. They taught their men to halt when they met strong resistance, to dig in, and to wait for heavier guns or more troops. There was comfort in this method. It seemed orderly, controlled, and safe. When bullets started flying, the instinct was to press bodies against the earth and let higher headquarters solve the problem. The battlefield was treated as a giant chessboard, where the big pieces moved only after long thought and smaller pieces stayed in place until ordered otherwise. The problem was that the battlefield itself was changing faster than the doctrine that guided it. Motor vehicles could move troops and guns more quickly than horse teams ever had. Air reconnaissance could spot concentrations of soldiers long before they reached the front. A formation that paused too long invited not only enemy shells but also encirclement and destruction. An army that waited for everything to be perfectly prepared risked being overtaken by an enemy who had no patience for such careful rituals. Inside this tension between old habits and new realities, a different way of thinking began to grow. Some officers started to question whether caution and central control were really the virtues they had been taught. They imagined a battlefield where small units did not simply absorb punishment and call for help, but reacted instantly, moved on their own initiative, and struck back before the enemy could settle into comfort. They argued that speed, surprise, and the ability of local leaders to act without waiting might be more valuable than carefully polished plans that took too long to unfold. These ideas did not immediately overturn tradition. Armies are slow to change, especially when the last great victory appears to justify the old methods. But cracks were appearing. Reports from foreign maneuvers, military journals, and quiet conversations in officer clubs started to circle around the same theme. The next war would punish hesitation. It would reward those who moved fastest, thought fastest, and dared to act without asking for permission every step of the way. Still, most training fields in the United States carried the rhythm of an earlier age. Rifle ranges echoed with the same commands heard since the previous war. Officers marked maps in classrooms, drawing arrows that advanced only after artillery preparation and careful coordination from above. The doctrine of the day treated soldiers foremost as parts of a machine controlled from distant headquarters. It trusted plans more than people, and central orders more than quick decisions under fire. That was the world into which George Catlett Marshall stepped as a reformer, long before he became famous as the Army Chief of Staff. At first glance, he did not look like a revolutionary figure. He was known for his calm manner, disciplined habits, and relentless attention to detail. Yet he carried within him a quiet conviction that the American army had to learn to fight differently or risk disaster when the next great conflict came. He had watched the chaos of earlier battles, seen how rigid plans crumbled on contact, and understood how often survival had depended on the quick judgment of officers close to the fight. As Marshall studied training methods at places like Fort Benning, he became increasingly convinced that the real weapon of the American army would not be any single rifle, tank, or aircraft. It would be the minds of its officers and soldiers, sharpened to react instantly when danger appeared. He imagined platoons that did not freeze under sudden fire, but shifted, flanked, and struck back without waiting for elaborate orders. He pictured junior leaders who understood the broader purpose of the fight well enough to adapt on the spot, rather than simply following a script handed down from far away. All this remained, at first, more vision than reality. The institution around him still leaned on procedures built after the last war. Regulations filled shelves with detailed instructions for almost every situation. Training schedules ticked along according to plans that were comfortable because they were familiar. Many officers saw no reason to risk changing methods that felt safe and time-tested. Yet events overseas were moving in a direction that would soon challenge every assumption. In Europe and Asia, armies were experimenting in ways that seemed bold, even reckless, to more cautious observers. Armored columns drove deep into enemy territory. Airstrikes fell on rear areas once thought secure. Communications networks turned scattered units into flexible webs that could redirect pressure in hours instead of days. The speed of combat was increasing, and with it the cost of slow reaction. For anyone paying close attention, it was becoming obvious that an army that waited too long to respond would be torn apart before its best plans could be fully assembled. Marshall watched this unfolding change with a growing sense of urgency. He saw that if the American army entered the next war with doctrines rooted in the previous one, its soldiers would pay the price in blood. The answer, in his mind, lay not in trying to control every detail from above, but in teaching every leader, from company commander down to squad leader, to think and act aggressively the moment they were struck. Doctrine had to shift from endurance to initiative, from mere survival under fire to immediate counteraction. The seeds of that transformation were about to be planted in the training grounds and classrooms of the interwar years. They would not attract headlines. There would be no cheering crowds, no dramatic photographs of these early changes. Yet the habits shaped there would someday determine how young Americans, crouched behind frozen hedgerows or huddled in foxholes under artillery fire, chose to respond when an unseen enemy opened fire. Whether they stayed pinned to the ground or rose to hit back would be decided, in large part, by what Marshall and his colleagues were about to do. When George Marshall arrived at the infantry school at Fort Benning in the late 1920s, it looked like any other quiet southern post. Red dirt roads, long rows of wooden buildings, pine trees lining the edges of open fields, and the steady routine of drills and classes. On the surface it was calm, almost sleepy. Yet to Marshall, this place was not a sleepy backwater. It was the workshop where the future of the American army would either be reshaped or left to rust. The infantry school was supposed to teach young officers how to fight the next war, but much of its teaching still revolved around the last one. Classroom walls carried maps of trench lines from France. Instructors leaned heavily on thick manuals. Exercises often followed set patterns. A unit advanced until it met resistance, halted, dug in, and waited for artillery. Problems were solved by sending messages up the chain and waiting for a decision from somewhere higher. It was professional and orderly, but to Marshall it felt dangerously slow. He began by watching quietly. Marshall had an eye for detail and a memory that startled those who worked with him. He walked the training grounds, stood at the back of classrooms, and studied written exercises handed in by young captains and lieutenants. He was not looking only at whether they remembered the rules. He was looking at how they thought under pressure. Time after time he saw variations of the same cautious pattern. When the imaginary enemy opened fire, the officer on the page ordered his men to hug the ground and call for support. Movement stopped as if the bullets had frozen the entire unit in place. Marshall knew that on a real battlefield, that instinct could be fatal. An enemy who had just opened fire was also exposed, firing, moving, and adjusting. Waiting gave that enemy time to bring up heavier weapons or to flank a pinned unit. The safest choice on paper could become the most dangerous choice in reality. So Marshall began to push against the old habits, not with loud speeches but with relentless training changes. He revised the map exercises, making them less comfortable and more urgent. Instead of giving officers long hours to study a situation, he gave them minutes. Instead of letting them sleep on a problem, he confronted them with fresh complications just as they thought they had found a neat solution. In many of these problems, when the enemy fired, the correct answer was not to stop and report, but to shift, assault, and counterattack immediately. Officers who tried to play it safe found their imaginary units swallowed up by flanking moves or crushed beneath artillery that they had invited by staying still. On the training fields, Marshall pushed for more realism. He supported the use of live fire in carefully controlled conditions, so officers and soldiers felt the crack and whistle of rounds over their heads and learned not to collapse into immobility at the first shock. He encouraged instructors to design exercises where small units suddenly came under simulated attack and had to respond without waiting for long chains of orders. Leaders were expected to move their men, find better positions, and hit back as quickly as possible. One pattern became very clear in his teaching. When the enemy hit you, you were not supposed to cling to the dirt and hope that others would save you. You were supposed to think, maneuver, and strike back fast. That did not mean reckless charges. It meant using cover, shifting fire, and attacking vulnerable points before the enemy could solidify. Marshall wanted officers who could look at a field, feel the danger, and still see opportunities for action. He also changed how criticism worked at the school. After exercises, he insisted on blunt and honest reviews. Officers who had hesitated too long under imaginary fire were told so directly. Those who had shown initiative were praised, but also reminded that every bold move still had to fit within a larger mission. The tone was demanding but not cruel. Marshall wanted these men to leave Fort Benning with a very clear message burned into their minds. On a real battlefield, there would be no time to read manuals. The habits they formed here would decide whether their soldiers lived or died. Marshall understood that doctrine was more than words in a book. It was the reflex that took over in the first seconds of an ambush, the instinct that drove a leader to crawl forward to see more instead of shrinking back to safety. So he quietly rewrote the expectations for those instincts. When junior officers submitted written solutions that were overly cautious, he would mark them down and ask where the initiative was. When they produced plans that showed bold but sensible counterattacks, he would hold them up as examples. The way the school spoke about leadership also began to shift. Instead of treating company and platoon commanders as mere messengers who carried out detailed plans from above, Marshall and like-minded instructors described them as the true cutting edge of the Army. Higher headquarters could set broad goals. It could assign missions and supply resources. But once a platoon disappeared into smoke and trees, everything depended on the judgment of the leader on the spot. That leader had to understand the larger purpose well enough to improvise when the original plan fell apart. This focus on decentralized command was not yet a catchphrase, but it was becoming a living practice. Officers were expected to imagine that radios would fail, that roads would be blocked, that orders would arrive late or not at all. In that confusion, they were not to sit helplessly and wait. They were to act in the spirit of the mission, trusting that higher commanders would accept and support their decisions if they were made with sound judgment and aggression. Slowly, a new kind of confidence began to appear in the young officers who passed through Fort Benning under Marshall's influence. They did not dismiss the importance of planning and coordination. They still studied artillery tables, logistics, and staff work. But layered on top of that was a growing belief that if they were hit, they should move, and if they saw an opening, they should press it. The enemy was no longer pictured as an unstoppable force that had to be met with rigid defenses. The enemy was a problem to be attacked from unexpected angles. Few outside the school paid much attention to these shifts. Training memorandums and revised lesson outlines did not make headlines. Yet the changes spread as graduates left Fort Benning and took command of companies and battalions across the small pre-war army. They carried with them the memory of a demanding instructor who had forced them to answer one relentless question. After the first shock of enemy fire, what will you do in the next few seconds? Those few seconds would someday matter in ways that no one on those red clay fields could fully imagine. Far away in the future lay snow-covered forests, frozen foxholes, and sudden attacks that would crash down on sleepy American positions in the dark of winter. In those moments, the officers and sergeants who had grown up under Marshall's doctrine would face choices every bit as stark as the map problems in their old classrooms. Whether they stayed pinned or hit back would trace its roots back to Fort Benning, where the habit of instant counterattack had first been drilled into their minds. By the late 1930s, the world outside the United States was already slipping toward catastrophe. In Spain, in China, and across Europe, new forms of warfare were tearing apart old assumptions faster than any classroom debate. Radio-linked tanks, aircraft, and infantry into fast-moving teams. Armored columns drove deep around flanks that once would have taken weeks to turn. When Germany crushed Poland and then France with stunning speed, every officer who followed world events could see the same lesson. The next great war would not be kind to slow thinkers or cautious doctrines. Inside the American Army, Marshall was no longer just a schoolman at Fort Benning. In 1939, he became the Army Chief of Staff, responsible for shaping the entire force as clouds of war gathered. The small peacetime army had to swell into a force capable of fighting across oceans, and it had to do so quickly. In theory, that growth could have been managed by simply multiplying the old patterns. More units, more manuals, more of the same. In practice, Marshall knew that this was the moment to push his ideas from the schoolhouse into the bloodstream of the entire army. The opportunity arrived in the form of huge field exercises that would come to be known as the Louisiana maneuvers and related large-scale tests in the southern states. Spread across farmland, small towns, rivers, and forests, these maneuvers turned parts of the American interior into a rehearsal stage for the war that seemed increasingly likely. Tens of thousands of troops were organized into opposing forces, complete with mock front lines, simulated casualties, and headquarters that tried to direct the chaos. On paper, these exercises looked like simple tests of readiness. In reality, they were laboratories where new doctrine could be tried, broken, and rebuilt. Units drove trucks and early armored vehicles along dusty roads, tried to coordinate with aircraft, and wrestled with the problem of how to move fast without losing control. Marshall watched closely from reports and visits. He was not interested only in who won each mock battle. He cared deeply about how they won and how they reacted when surprised. In many early maneuvers, the old habits showed themselves quickly. One side would make contact, come under simulated fire, and then slip into a kind of paralysis while messages traveled up and down the chain of command. Headquarters tried to control every detail. Orders were written, revised, and transmitted while imaginary enemy units were already on the move again. Some defensive plans assumed that units could stay fixed in place and absorb punishment until help arrived. In these exercises, just as in the classroom problems, such plans often ended with blue or red forces cut off and declared destroyed. The most interesting moments came when a few commanders broke that pattern. Some aggressive leaders used trucks and armored vehicles to swing wide around flanks, appearing in the rear areas of their opponents with startling speed. Others, when hit along a front, did not simply dig in. They shifted reserves, launched local counterattacks, and turned what was supposed to be a clean breakthrough into a costly struggle for the attacker. These maneuvers exposed not only technical weaknesses, such as poor radio discipline or clumsy traffic control on narrow roads, but also the deeper mental habits of the officer corps. Marshall treated the entire series of exercises as a vast practical exam on the question that had haunted him since Fort Benning. What happened in the first few minutes after a unit was struck hard? Did commanders wait or did they move? Did they cling to old patterns or did they adapt? After each major phase, he and his staff pored over reports. They read comments from umpires who had judged the simulated firefights, complaints from officers, and reflections from soldiers who had marched through swamps and across fields under the watchful eyes of evaluators. Again and again the same themes emerged. Units that tried to fight by rigid, centrally directed plans tended to fall behind the tempo of the exercises. By the time their carefully prepared orders reached forward units, the situation had already changed. In contrast, formations that empowered junior leaders to act quickly, that trusted battalion and company commanders to seize local opportunities, usually did better. They were not free of mistakes. Some bold moves failed, but their willingness to strike back rapidly forced their opponents to constantly adjust. The maneuvers also revealed weaknesses that could not be ignored. Logistics systems broke down under the strain of movement. Communications nets jammed or failed at critical moments. Some officers simply could not keep up with the demands of directing fast-moving, dispersed formations. Marshall did not try to hide these problems. Instead, he used them as proof that large parts of the Army's doctrine and leadership needed sharpening. Promotions and reassignments followed. Some promising younger officers rose faster than they might have in quieter times, while some older ones found themselves moved aside. Through it all, the principle of immediate, aggressive response under fire kept surfacing as a key factor. Reports described units that, when suddenly attacked in the maneuvers, threw out hasty flanking forces, shifted fire quickly, and regained the initiative. Others, under similarly staged attacks, lay still, sent urgent messages to the rear, and waited. The umpires usually judged that second pattern harshly. In a real war, such passivity would invite further blows. The exercises made that truth visible in a way that no lecture could have matched. Beyond tactics, these great rehearsals helped crystallize a culture. The American army that emerged from the southern maneuvers was still learning, still imperfect, but it now carried a growing expectation that pressure would be met with movement, not paralysis. The language of official reports and training guidance began to echo ideas that had once been confined to Fort Benning classrooms. Initiative, speed, and decentralized decision-making were no longer fringe concepts. They were becoming official expectations. At the same time, events overseas grew darker. Europe was fully at war. Britain fought on after the fall of France, relying heavily on sea power and air defense while watching the continent beneath the shadow of occupation. In North Africa, forces maneuvered across deserts that would later become very familiar to American soldiers. The United States remained formally at peace for a time, but the direction of history was clear enough for Marshall. The doctrines forged in exercises at home would soon be tested in places far from Louisiana fields and Carolina pine woods. When the soldiers of the United States finally crossed the ocean and stepped into the war in late 1942, they carried with them more than new uniforms and fresh equipment. Inside their training, buried in the way their officers thought about danger and opportunity, were the quiet reforms that had begun at Fort Benning and spread through the big maneuvers in the southern states. North Africa would be the first real test of whether those ideas could survive contact with a determined enemy. The land they entered did not look anything like the pine woods or muddy fields where they had rehearsed. North Africa offered wide stretches of desert broken by rocky ridges, narrow roads, and scattered villages clinging to water sources. Cold nights followed hot days. Dust found its way into engines, weapons, and food. The distances were huge, and the lines of supply stretched back through ports that were still being organized. This was not simply a new front. It was a proving ground that cared very little about theories written in manuals. The first major landings, known as the torch operations, went forward with a mix of nervousness and hope. The American forces were newcomers on a stage where British and German units had already spent years trading blows. Many of the senior American commanders had never led large formations in battle. Their troops arrived with modern weapons but with little practical experience beyond what they had gained in training and maneuvers. Soon enough, the North African campaign exposed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the young American army. In some early engagements, units moved with the kind of energy Marshall had hoped for. They advanced quickly, tried to flank enemy positions, and used their mobility to threaten rear areas. Yet in other fights the old habits returned. When shells and machine gun fire suddenly swept exposed ground, some formations froze, uncertain, their leaders overwhelmed by the speed at which the situation changed. The most painful lessons came in the battles around places like Kasserine Pass in early 1943. There, German forces under experienced commanders struck with concentrated armor and well-practiced coordination between tanks, infantry, and aircraft. American positions that had seemed secure crumbled under the pressure. Some units lacked proper fields of fire and mutual support. Communications broke down. In more than one sector, when the enemy struck hard, forward units fell back in confusion rather than counterattacking in a coordinated way. To outside observers, these setbacks looked like proof that the American army was not yet ready for a serious contest. To Marshall and to officers who had grown up inside his system, they were harsh reminders that doctrine on paper was not enough. The habits of instant reaction and aggressive counterattack had not yet sunk deep enough into every level of leadership. In some sectors, local commanders had been placed too far forward without clear authority to shift forces quickly. In others, higher headquarters had tried to control details that should have been left to those closer to the fight, slowing the response at the worst possible moment. Yet even in the middle of these painful days there were hints of something different. Reports from certain battalions told of officers and sergeants who, when caught under sudden attack, did not simply cling to the nearest cover. They shifted their men to better ground, set up hasty ambushes, and used small local counterattacks to blunt enemy thrusts. These were not grand maneuvers drawn across a map in a warm office. They were quick decisions made in dust and fear by leaders who had internalized the idea that the safest choice was often to move toward the problem, not away from it. The command structure also began to adjust. Leaders who had failed to adapt were replaced. General George Patton took over a major American field command in North Africa and brought with him a relentless emphasis on speed, discipline, and offensive action. His personality was very different from Marshall's calm style, but in one critical respect they shared the same core belief. An army that lay still under fire would be defeated. An army that learned to hit back quickly and keep moving could recover even from serious mistakes. Under this new pressure, training inside the theater intensified. Between battles, units drilled on rapid movement to contact, on organizing hasty defenses that could transform into counterattacks, and on keeping communications alive even when columns were scattered along bad roads. Staffs practiced making faster decisions with incomplete information, accepting that waiting for perfectly clear reports was a luxury that war did not allow. Meanwhile, the North African environment itself forced improvisation. Long supply lines meant that fuel and ammunition could be scarce. Commanders had to learn when to push hard and when to pause, always aware that an overextended unit could become a target. Dust storms cut visibility and made coordination harder. Roads clogged with traffic whenever multiple formations tried to move at once. All these factors tested the idea of decentralized command. If junior leaders understood the larger plan, they could adjust when messages were delayed or conditions changed. If they did not, even the best written orders from above could dissolve into confusion. Slowly, performance improved. In later stages of the North African campaign, American units showed a better ability to recover from sudden blows. When the enemy attacked, they were more likely to throw out flank patrols, to use artillery quickly and aggressively, and to push local reserves into counterattacks that disrupted the opponent's rhythm. The confidence of the soldiers grew as they survived engagements that would have shattered them earlier in the campaign. The British allies watched this growth with a mixture of relief and cautious approval. They had carried much of the Desert War burden before American arrival and had their own hard-earned doctrines about dealing with German armor and air power. Over time, the two armies learned from each other. The British shared their experience with defensive depth and combined arms coordination. The Americans contributed fresh manpower, industrial strength, and an increasingly flexible approach to battlefield decision-making that emphasized seizing and holding the initiative. By the time the North African campaign drew to a close, with Axis forces finally trapped and forced to surrender in Tunisia, the army that emerged was no longer the same force that had first stumbled ashore months earlier. It had endured real defeat and real victory. It had buried its dead in foreign soil and learned, often the hard way, how quickly fortunes could change when a commander hesitated or an opportunity was missed. Most importantly for the long story of doctrine, the campaign had confirmed in blood the basic insight that Marshall had pressed since his days at Fort Benning. When an enemy strikes, the critical moments are measured in seconds and minutes, not in hours. Leaders who instinctively look for ways to move, to shift, to counterpunch, can wrest back control even when surprised. Leaders who wait too long, hoping for clearer orders or perfect conditions, often find that events have already outrun them. The lessons from North Africa did not stay in desert notebooks. After-action reports traveled back across the Atlantic. Training centers in the United States adjusted their scenarios to reflect the realities of armored thrusts and sudden air attack. Instructors quoted examples from Kasserine and later battles, pointing to what had gone wrong when units failed to respond quickly enough, and what had gone right when they did. New divisions preparing to ship out studied these reports with intense interest. They knew they would soon face their own tests in new landscapes. Ahead lay Sicily, Italy, and then the long-awaited landings in Western Europe. Each theater would bring its own set of problems, its own harsh examinations of the army's evolving doctrine. Yet the first trials in North Africa had already drawn a rough line between two kinds of armies. One tried to survive by holding on and waiting for conditions to improve. The other was slowly, painfully, learning to survive by constantly trying to seize back the initiative, even when tired, surprised, or short on supplies. That second path was still being built, one engagement at a time. The final and most brutal test of this mindset still waited in a cold forest far to the north, in a season when the ground would be frozen, the days short, and the margin for error narrower than ever. By the time the North African fighting ended, the American army had taken its first hard punches and learned that doctrine was not an abstract thing. It lived or died in the way exhausted men reacted when shells began to fall and armor appeared on the horizon. The next steps in the war would carry that same army onto new shores and into new kinds of terrain, each one testing whether the habits hammered in training and shaped in desert battles would hold. The invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943 was the first move across the water from Africa toward the European mainland. The land there was rocky and steep, cut by narrow roads and scattered towns built on high ground. Once again the pattern repeated. At first, coordination was uneven and some units struggled to keep up with fast-moving situations. But as the campaign unfolded, American formations became quicker at exploiting openings. When enemy lines bent, commanders were more willing to send forces around flanks rather than only straight ahead. Local counterattacks against German and Italian positions became more common, turning what could have been static firefights into growing pressure that the defenders struggled to contain. From Sicily, the war flowed onto the Italian mainland. Italy offered a different kind of challenge. Instead of wide spaces, the Allies found a narrow peninsula filled with mountains, rivers, stone villages, and well-prepared defensive lines. Here, the enemy could force brutal frontal fights, making movement slow and costly. Yet even in this difficult environment, the doctrine of initiative and immediate response shaped battles. When German forces launched sudden counterattacks down mountain valleys or out of fog, the American units that held their ground best were usually those whose junior leaders had learned to act quickly on their own judgment. Artillery observers shifted fire without waiting for long chains of approval. Company and battalion commanders threw together hasty blocking positions and small local counterthrusts that sealed off breakthroughs before they could spread. The fighting was often muddy, cold, and exhausting, and progress came in painful steps. Still, the army carried forward the idea that the answer to a blow was not only to absorb it but to look for ways to strike back before the enemy gained confidence. As the Italian campaign dragged on, preparations began for a far larger jump. The opening of a western front in France would bring American and British forces onto the continent in strength. Planning for the invasion of Normandy forced senior commanders to think once more about doctrine in the clearest possible way. No plan for landing on defended beaches could survive if the units expected perfect conditions or long pauses between shocks. The first waves of troops would face confusion, scattered landings, and sudden enemy fire. The only way to turn the beachhead into a foothold was to rely on small groups of soldiers and their leaders making fast decisions on their own. On the morning of the landings in June 1944, that expectation was put to a harsh test. Many units did not land where the maps said they would. Smoke, tides, and German defenses turned neat diagrams into messy reality. Yet time and again, scattered groups of Americans pushed inland anyway. Officers and sergeants who had memorized plans found that much of what they had prepared no longer applied. Instead, they used the underlying intent. Get off the beach. Move toward the high ground. Link up with neighboring units. Many small improvised movements, driven by local initiative, slowly created a stable front where a complete failure could easily have occurred. Once inland, the armies met a kind of terrain that few had fully imagined. The hedgerow country, called bocage, turned Normandy into a maze of earthen banks and thick vegetation. Fields were small and enclosed, sight lines were short, and each hedgerow could hide a machine gun nest or an anti-tank weapon. At first, armored units found themselves trapped on narrow lanes and funneled into deadly kill zones. Infantry that tried to cross open gaps between hedgerows were hit from hidden positions. The response to this new problem did not come from staff officers alone. In workshops and field positions, soldiers and junior engineers experimented with ways to cut openings through the hedgerows. They welded metal prongs onto the fronts of tanks, creating crude but effective devices that could bust through the earthen walls. Tactics changed as well. Instead of sending large formations in rigid lines, units began to move in smaller groups, using coordinated fire and maneuver from hedgerow to hedgerow. Local leaders learned to call for supporting fire quickly, to shift angles of attack, and to keep the enemy off balance. This was doctrine in motion. The principle was the same that Marshall had pressed years earlier. When the enemy adapts and hits hard, the answer is not to freeze and complain that conditions are unfair. The answer is to find a way to move, however awkwardly at first, until those moves begin to impose a new rhythm on the fight. Over weeks of hard combat in Normandy, American units became more skilled at turning German strongpoints into temporary advantages. Once the defenders revealed their fire, they could be flanked, suppressed, and crushed. When the breakout finally came, it was driven in large part by the same values of speed and initiative that had been tested in earlier campaigns. After the success of a concentrated offensive near St. Lo, American armored and infantry units poured through the gaps. Commanders pressed their units forward, sometimes faster than logistics officers would have preferred. They exploited confusion in the German ranks, refusing to give the enemy time to re-establish solid defensive lines. This aggressive exploitation turned a local success into a rolling advance that carried American forces across much of France in a matter of weeks. Yet speed carried its own risks. Supply lines stretched thin. Vehicles wore out. Soldiers became tired from constant movement. In some cases, advances outpaced fuel supplies. There were moments when forward units had to pause not because the enemy had stopped them, but because they lacked gasoline and ammunition. Still, the overall pattern showed how far the army had come from the slow, cautious habits of earlier eras. The instinct now was to keep pressing as long as there was any chance to maintain momentum. Alongside these successes, the German army showed that it remained dangerous even when retreating. Counterattacks still struck from unexpected directions. Local commanders on the German side used their own traditions of initiative to create temporary crises. In those moments, the American response once again highlighted the years of doctrinal change. Units that came under sudden assault were more likely to establish hasty defensive lines, call down quick artillery barrages, and push out immediate counterattacks to blunt the enemy before he could widen breakthroughs. By autumn 1944, American forces had crossed much of France and stood at or near the borders of Germany in several sectors. To many observers, it seemed the war in the West might be entering its final phase. There was talk of the enemy being nearly finished, of the remaining resistance being only a matter of time. Some units were shifted north or south to support particular operations. Others went into what looked like quieter sectors to rest and reorganize. Among these areas was a region of hills and forests called the Ardennes. The Ardennes had a reputation as difficult ground for large-scale operations. Thick woods, narrow roads, and rugged terrain made rapid movement hard. For that reason, Allied planners believed it was unlikely that the Germans would launch a major offensive there. The sector became a place where relatively inexperienced units or tired divisions could recuperate, supported by more seasoned formations in nearby regions. Defensive lines existed, but in many places they were thin, with wide gaps between strongpoints. Behind these front lines, supply dumps and command posts settled into what felt like a rear area. Soldiers who had survived the brutal battles in Normandy and the rapid drive across France now found themselves in quiet villages, tending vehicles, repairing equipment, and trying to snatch a few weeks of rest. Snow began to appear, and with it the familiar struggles of winter warfare, from frozen ground to the simple misery of staying warm. Yet beneath the surface calm, the enemy was making plans of his own. The German High Command had not accepted defeat. Instead, they prepared a bold gamble. They gathered armored formations, infantry, and artillery for a surprise offensive designed to split the Allied front, capture key crossings on the Meuse River, and perhaps force a political crisis among the opposing coalition. The chosen axis of attack ran straight through the Ardennes, the very region the Allies had judged least likely to host a major operation. In the weeks before the offensive, there were scattered signs that something unusual might be building. Intelligence reports noted increased radio traffic, the movement of units, and other hints. Some analysts warned of the possibility of a German winter attack. But the weight of expectations pressed in the other direction. Many believed the enemy lacked the strength for a large offensive and would focus instead on defending his own borders. As a result, the frontline units in the Ardennes entered December 1944 with little sense that they stood in the path of a coming storm. Among the American divisions in and around that region were formations that had been through some of the toughest fights of the war, including airborne units that had jumped into Normandy and fought in Holland. There were also newer divisions still gaining experience. Scattered among them were artillery battalions, engineer units, and armor. The common thread running through these forces was the doctrine they now shared, built over years of training and fighting. If they were hit, they were supposed to react fast, hold, and counterattack whenever possible. No one yet knew how brutally that doctrine would be tested in the cold days ahead. The forests of the Ardennes, with their snow-covered trees and small villages, were about to become the stage for one of the largest and bloodiest battles the American army would ever fight. In that coming struggle, near places called Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Houffalize, every lesson from Fort Benning, from the southern maneuvers, from North Africa, Italy, and Normandy would be pulled into a single, desperate examination.